Good evening.
Hello.
Congrats on Friday, the end of the working week.
Thanks. You too. What topics do you talk about?
Well, in general, with the Ukrainians lately, well, one of the questions that I don't know. I don't remember if I talked with you.
I asked a question. Wait. Is there any topic? Then we will decide on the question.
The situation in Ukraine, what is
I don't
happening in
discuss the
Ukraine?
situation in Ukraine. What is your business with Ukraine? You are a citizen of Russia, right?
I do have my business.
Wait. You are a citizen of Russia, right?
So what? Yes, of
What is
course.
your business with Ukraine? Why do you care so much about Ukraine?
I'm concerned about the UK, the USA, and France
Let's
too.
talk about Great Britain. What book have you read about the history of Great Britain?
I haven't read the history of Great Britain, but
But
I'm
you're still
interested in this
concerned.
country. Why can't I be?
Explain why you're concerned. I don't mind. Is there any explanation?
I like Anglo-Saxon culture.
Why is Ukraine bothering you? Do you like Ukrainian culture?
Because I'm Russian, and Ukrainians are Slavs, brotherly people.
Who told you that we are brotherly people?
I know it.
From where?
From history.
One moment. Is there such a classification, brotherly people? There are classifications of languages. There are Slavic languages. There are Romano-Germanic languages. A linguistic classification. Who came up with a classification of brotherly or not brotherly peoples? How do you define it?
From history.
From history. So, if we once lived in the same state, we are brotherly nation. Or is it different?
We have a common past.
If Austrians and Hungarians lived in Austro-Hungarian monarchy, are Austrians and Hungarians brotherly people?
No, not brotherly, but they have roots.
Why are we brotherly people then? What roots do they have? They have different roots. The Austrians are the Germans.
Because we are Slavs, and we have a past.
Austrians are Germans, and Hungarians are Finno-Hungarians, who came from the north of Europe.
Absolutely right.
Are all Slavs are brotherly nations? For you, brotherly nations are Bulgarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, or only Ukrainian?
Ukrainians are closer,
More brotherly.
are more related than
You have categories of brotherness.
Bulgarians. Though Bulgarians are also close to us.
So I can't figure out what kind of classification is the brotherly peoples? What is the reason or the basis of this classification?
Slavs, Christians, Orthodox.
Slavs, Serbs, and Croats, although some are Orthodox, others are Catholics, but it did not prevent these peoples from fighting each other in the early 90s.
Unfortunately, yes.
Why did these brotherly peoples fight? What do you think?
They don't consider themselves to be brotherly peoples.
I don't consider Russians to be brotherly either.
A good example. Serbs, Croats, Russians, Ukrainians. Yes, a good example.
I don't consider Russians to be a brotherly nation, because there is no such classification.
There was a division of faith. Different faith. They have different religions.
So what? So if there are different religions, it means that they are not brotherly nations. Do you know that among Ukrainians...
It's a break point that divides them.
Do you know that among Ukrainians, there are a lot of Greek Catholics? This is not Orthodox. Protestants too. They are not Orthodox. Are the Greek Catholics Ukrainians also brothers, or is their faith divided?
Oh, how many are there?
Over 3.5 million Greek Catholics in Ukraine.
In percentages?
Roughly 10%.
And how many Protestants are there?
A little less. So, are these fraternal peoples for you, Ukrainians, who are Greek Catholics and Protestants, or are they already falling out of the category of fraternal peoples?
That's a good question.
You have no answer to this question. Therefore, I don't understand what is the category based on. But, as an historian, I understand who invented the category of the brotherly peoples. I don't understand why Russian citizens still use this category.
I've explained to you why. Maybe I'm mistaken, although I don't think so. But I consider Ukrainians to be a brotherly nation, even if Ukrainians don't.
Why? Because our faith is the same. We have different faiths. I am an atheist,
majority.
And I think that the majority of the population of Ukraine is also an atheist. And what does Brotherhood of Nations have to do with this, based on a single faith?
So you want to say that because you're an atheist and you don't
Because
consider
I myself am atheist.
Russians, and so doesn't the majority.
It's just that, as a historian, I can explain that the category of brotherly nations was invented in Soviet time. Before that, there was no such category as brotherly nations. It was in Soviet times, when we got into one Stalinist concentration camp in order to keep Ukrainians on the chain. They came up with the category, look, you are our brothers, you must live peacefully with us, it's good for us. Work for Comrade Stalin, toil tirelessly, get a ration of bread, then you will be brothers. And if you complain and revolt against Comrade Stalin, we will deport you or shoot you. I don't use Soviet calcs. Soviet Union is gone for over 30 years.
Okay.
Was I clear? You had a question for me.
Oh, wasn't it in Russian Empire too?
There was no category of brotherly nations there. In the Russian Empire, from the end of the 19th century, there was a theory that there is one Russian Orthodox people who are divided into Great Russians, and Lenin also wrote that he is a Great Russian. Little Russians, these are modern Ukrainians, and White Russians. This was the official view in the Russian Empire. In the February and October revolutions, they destroyed it all. But the Bolsheviks again created the same empire, only in a head, not with the emperor, but in the head with the communists. And in order to keep other nations, they had come up with a fairy tale about brotherly nations. Are you calling Cossacks brotherly people?
Let's go to this point in detail. It turns out that the Bolsheviks invented the Ukrainians.
No, they invented the theory of brotherly nations.
But the concept was Great Russia, Malorussia, Belarus, and Ukraine.
It was an official concept of government.
Yes.
And at the level of science, it was already clear to both philosophers and historians that Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians speak Eastern Slavic languages. Each of these nations has its own history, mentality, culture. There is an official ideology, and there is a scientific explanation. The official ideology was as follows, and the scientific explanation already appeared then, that these are three Eastern Slavic peoples with their own culture, and so on. We were driven into the Stalin's concentration camp. I told you about it. We had our own state, the Ukrainian People's Republic. It existed for 3 years.
Yes, I know.
Yes. The Bolsheviks captured this state, invented Soviet Ukraine. Yes, indeed. It was the Bolsheviks who invented Soviet Ukraine. And in order to keep us chained, they called us a brotherly nation for the Russians. In the Soviet Union, not only Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians were considered brotherly peoples, but all 15 republics were considered brotherly. The Kazakhs were brothers, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and so on. Now, for some reason, this myth remains that only Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians are brotherly peoples. And how about the Kazakhs, Lithuanians, Latvians? Not brotherly?
Of course, Latvians and Lithuanians were never considered brotherly.
In the Soviet Union. You are mistaken. In the Soviet Union, it was called the Brotherly Nations and the Brotherly Republic.
Brotherly republics, yes. Brotherly peoples, no.
Peoples too. No, you can open any Soviet children's books. Read about it. They repeat the same
Why do I
thing.
need to? I lived back then. I remember.
Brotherly peoples, like Latvians. There were always such posters with different costumes. Ukrainians too.
Brotherly
And
republics.
And there were all the brotherly peoples. You are mistaken. And for some reason, you only have Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians.
I can be wrong, but...
Okay. Yes, we are going in circles here. You use the Soviet approach. I don't use this approach. There is no Soviet Union for 30 years.
I have a question. What do you think about, or rather, whom do you consider the residents of Donetsk and Luhansk republics, which supported Russia in 2014 and now to be?
It is very simple. It is called separatists and collaborators in any state. If, for example, you, on the territory of Russia, for example, the inhabitants of the Voronezh and Kursk regions wanted to join Ukraine, you would also evaluate them as separatists and collaborators. This is an international practice. Nothing new, really. No concepts like brotherly nations, or whatever. Everything has long been defined.
I got it. I asked for your opinion because you are not the first
This
person.
is not an opinion. This is a legal definition of people who stand for the disunion of the part of the state from the state. This is called a separatist. And if this person, all the people who stand for the disunion of the state from the state, are called separatists, he can consider himself anyone, even Buddha. But from the point of view of the law, he is a separatist. And if he calls another state and armed forces of another state to his territory, and goes to the state or military structures of another state, he is called a collaborant. This is not an opinion. This is a legal definition.
I understand you. Your opinion
I think you would have the
coincides
same
with the
opinion
legal
if
definition.
you had a situation like that with the residents of Kursk and Voronezh. Oh, or you would not.
I'm not asking about that. I asked you. I asked many people
Now
to
I'm
know
asking
their
you.
opinion. Yes, I would call them separatists.
And collaborators. There is nothing to be invented here.
Here is a question. The conflict between Russians and Ukrainians. What do you
There
think
is a
personally?
conflict between Russia and Ukraine, not between Russians and Ukrainians,
Well, okay.
because not only Russians live on the territory of your state, you have 140 ethnic groups living there. Dagestanians and Buryats are not Russians. They are from Russia, but aren't Russian.
But many Ukrainians hate.
Many Ukrainians. You asked me, and I answered them. I'm not going to answer for other Ukrainians. That's their personal opinion.
So, then I'll ask you a different question. All right. Some part of Ukrainians hate Russians and think that the Russian-Ukrainian peace is impossible. What's your
It's their right.
opinion?
I will not say that I hate Russians. I like the phrase of the deceased Zhorkha Dudayev very much. He said that there is no hatred of Russians, and there is a contempt, like for the dead cattle. That's about my attitude. Not to Russians, but to the population of Russia, because they are the people who attacked my country and my people and killed them. So hatred was back. In year 2014, hatred for these 9 years has long passed, but contempt as to dead cattle, as to slaves, people who do not understand what is being done in the world, I have such contempt. May I ask you a question?
Yes, go ahead.
In your personal opinion, when did the conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine begin? In 2014 or in 2022?
In 2014.
In your opinion, what is the cause of this conflict? Or are there multiple causes?
Conflict of 2014.
The conflict between Russia and Ukraine that started in 2014.
I thought about it for a long time, but I couldn't fully understand it for myself.
Understood. Thank you. Any more questions to me?
Am I being recorded?
Of course.
Okay.
I'm a blogger. I talk to people from Russia on the subject of history. I rarely talk about politics when there is nothing to talk about. Then I have to talk only about politics.
Question. Today, gas is supplied to Europe through Ukraine from Russia.
Yes.
And Ukraine receives money for gas transit from Russia, as far as I know.
Yes, it does.
How to explain it?
Very simple. It is still a hybrid war. Still, although it is a large scale, but hybrid. That is, some trade and economic relations are still preserved. We get paid only for transit. We do not buy gas from you, if you didn't know. We buy your gas in reverse, which is already called Slovak gas. We buy this gas from
Understood.
Slovakia, and you have relations with Europe through us. We technically have nothing to do with this. If you do not pay us for gas transit, it is your problem. You pay. We take money. You have relations with Europe on this gas pipeline, not with us.
But this is nonsense, by and large. Do you agree with, in general,
If we take the
this kind of relationship?
stereotype of the Great Patriotic War, then yes, nonsense. But it was 70 years ago. Now the wars are going on the same way. It's a fact. We would like to see it as the Great Patriotic War, and not to have anything to do with you. But you have relations not with us, but with Europe. You supply gas there, they pay you for this gas, and we take it for transit. If you stop supplying gas to Europe, you will not pay for transit. Everything depends on you. We can't close this gas pipeline because we have a duty to Europe. But you can close it. Close the valve, and this nonsense will cease to exist.
It's a good and convenient position for
What
everyone.
are we supposed to do? Blow up the gas pipeline on our land to break relations with European countries?
Yes, I understand. I'm not calling for you to blow up the gas pipeline. Otherwise, it will turn out that I'm a terrorist after your recording. But it turns out that Russia is selling.
Selling gas to Europe? Yes.
It sells gas to Europe, makes weapons with this money, which it uses to strike Ukraine.
The amount of gas being sold has already decreased by a lot if you have followed.
Yes, but its price has increased.
No. The price has dropped. Have you not followed the gas prices?
I did recently.
So why do you say that it has increased if it has fallen? It's a question for you. You don't want to close the valve, and that's it. It all depends on you,
Well,
not
okay,
on us.
well,
What do we have to do with it?
so how does it? It turns out that Russia sells
Okay.
gas through Ukraine and gets money for it. Russia makes weapons with this money and strikes Ukraine with them. And Ukraine gets money from Russia and also buys weapons.
Yes, that's how it happens. Fact is fact. It's a strange fact. I completely agree with you. Completely. But it is like that. We can't refuse, because if we refuse, you will declare us a diplomatically unreliable country. You have to decide. If you think that selling gas is not necessary, then close the valve to Europe, and goodbye. By the way, I talked to a Russian guy from Surga where they get gas. He said that gas production has slowed a lot, and that they are only producing gas to prevent gas wells from being preserved. And they don't actually give gas flow. Well, Russia, I mean, at least he told me so.
Maybe I'm not ready, not prepared to answer this question.
That's why I asked this kind of question. Just like the Turks captured the northern part of Cyprus in the 1970s, and there too, the Turkish Republic of Cyprus was proclaimed there, and yet they are in a state of war, an undeclared one, for 30 or 50 years. But still, they have some relations there. The world is complicated.
I guess I'm thinking with stereotypes. Maybe.
Well, yes, you think black and white. It can be gray sometimes.
How do you personally feel about Belarusians?
I don't feel anything
What can you? Look, you're from Ukraine.
about the Belarusian people or the leadership.
About the Belarusian people? Well, that too, but people is my first question.
No opinion. Belarusian people, excuse me, are just as inert as people of Russia. Belarusian people allowed to strike Ukraine from their territory. They do. Today, once again, from the territory of Belarus, from Makurishi, another bomber took off from the airfield. We had military air alarm about this. In Belarus, Russian soldiers undergo treatment. They retreated through Belarus from the Kiev region and Chernihiv region back then in March 2022. Belarusians sit quietly and keep silent. Well, I feel contempt, probably. A people who does not want to fight for their freedom gives their territory for aggression against the neighboring people. Well, such a people they are, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Although, personally, if I met any Belarusian, what would I have to do with him? Belarusian, sure, whatever.
Recently, I saw. Do you know the name Dmitry Gordon?
Yes, I do.
Have you heard of Alesia Batsman?
As far as I know, she's his wife.
Okay, yes. A week or two ago, maybe 4, I saw an interview with Batsman and Schuster. Ever heard of Schuster?
Yes, I have. All 3 of them are manipulators. I'm telling you straight away for me,
I see.
firstly, it's not journalism. When Schuster was young and worked at European radio stations, I listened to him as a child. Yes, I was very interested. After he appeared on Ukrainian television, he became a complete pro-government manipulator. So I have no respect for these people. What do you want to ask me about
I
them?
meant to ask about that dialogue. Zoe Batsman was talking to Schuster.
I haven't heard this dialogue.
I'll tell you.
I won't discuss a dialogue I haven't heard.
I'll tell you my thoughts, how you feel about it.
What for?
What was said there?
Maybe you misunderstood the idea. Maybe I will misunderstand it. It's called discussing the skin of an unkilled bear.
Well, the thing is, I'll talk about it if you'll excuse me.
Please.
So, Batsman talks to Shuster, and Shuster says that after the victory of Ukraine, it needs to be resolved today. In order for Ukraine to have a light, free, economic, etc., etc., it will be necessary to resolve the issue with migrants, because there will be a shortage of people, and so on. Batsman kept silent, didn't answer anything, and he says that it will be necessary to decide who to bring in. And he said that we had decided this in the Syrian refugee camps. Personally, to recruit people. He is a citizen of Canada and Italy, if my memory serves me right. As far as I know.
No idea.
What do you think about the idea of filling Ukraine with migrants after the war?
What? Migrants?
Let's say non-European migrants. To maintain the demographic, because...
I didn't think about this question. I'm not interested in this yet again. Unkilled bear. Yes, there will be a shortage of people. I understand that. I don't know where people will come from. I'm not the Minister of Migration Policy. I'm a historian. If you have a good question about history, I'm ready to discuss it with you.
There is an expression, the history is written by the winner. Is this really so?
No, it's a premonition of the past. So, there was the Great Patriotic War. The Russian historians wrote the history of the Great Patriotic War, and the Germans had no right to write history whatsoever. When you start to analyze these beautiful phrases in practice, it turns out that there is no essence behind a beautiful phrase. Everyone has the right to write their own history. That's it. And everyone writes their own history.
But there is history that the majority learns.
What? Majority?
Well, look, okay.
Russian society lives by the stories written by Russian historians. German society lives by the stories written by German historians. Where do the winners write history here? Do the losers have no right to write their own stories?
If Hitler had won, he would have written another history.
And he had been writing it. History is written by Russian historians and German historians. If Hitler had won, historians would have written differently, and then they would rewrite it after his death. The meaning of history is in it being constantly rewritten.
Basically, history is constant rewriting. Where is truth?
There is no truth in history, unfortunately. This is a humanitarian science, a humanitarian knowledge, not physics. It is difficult to achieve the truth here, and it is very difficult to achieve the truth in physics now, especially in quantum mechanics. There are only mathematical theories, and there is no truth there. History has taken place, but each generation, in each country, rewrites history, because new sources appear, new sources are found, and we reconsider these sources. The situation changes. You see, when there was a Soviet Union, they wrote the glory of the Communist Party, how great the Communists were. They went to battle. We were told how they were on the march, and so on. The Soviet Union has disintegrated. So, should we describe history the same? Write about the glory of the Communist Party, and how great they were? No, of course not. We need to rethink it. We understand that the Communists created their own myth of the Great Patriotic War. They wrote it as the Soviet Party and the Soviet motherland demanded. But this myth has ceased to exist with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Or is it not so? Or should we write
Okay,
glory
fine.
to the Communist Party?
Okay, I agree with that. But then it turns out that what is happening today can be rethought in a completely different way in some time.
Yes, absolutely. But there are some things that have already been established and are not rethought, and they will hardly be rethought in any other way. For example, the Great Patriotic War. Who attacked whom? The Germans attacked the Soviet Union. No matter how many generations have passed, nothing will change. The Germans are the aggressor. The Soviet Union is the victim. There are things that cannot change, but there are things that can be rethought. Just like the modern war, there is an aggressor of the Russian Federation. There is a victim, Ukraine. We can talk about reasons, rethink. You can bring your own reasons. I can bring my own reasons. But no one will write. Well, maybe in some North Korea, they will write that Ukraine is to blame, and Russia has nothing to do with it. But for the whole world, it is clear who is an aggressor and who is a victim. There are things that do not change, and there are things that will be rethought, especially in ancient times, the Rus, other places, and so on. And
Then the question is, can evil be done with good intentions?
this is a philosophical question. It has nothing to do with history. There is no concept of evil or good in history. There is a concept of cause and effect in history, and whether it is good or bad, it is up to you to assess. For example, you think that war is a good thing, and that the Russians attacked Ukraine is good. This is your personal point of view, and there is no one to judge it. And some people think that war is evil, war is blood, war is impossible. A human should not be waging wars. But this is a philosophical point of view, not a historical
That's
one.
why I asked about rethinking. What if other generations will think differently?
Do you think that the human generation will think that war is a good thing?
I don't know. Maybe they will.
Maybe they will. I think that war is evil. And the one who starts a war commits a crime against the world. This is written in the UN Charter. That the biggest crime that exists in the modern world is a crime against peace. Otherwise, it's like George Orwell's 1984 novel, Freedom is slavery, war is peace, ignorance is power, and so on.
Honestly, I have the book, but I haven't read it yet.
Read it. There is a good phrase by Tolstoy, I can't literally quote it, but the meaning is that a person who thinks that war is a good thing is an idiot. How can you reinterpret the war in a different way and say that it is good?
You will say that this is a forbidden argument, but then how to assess the actions of other military countries against other countries? I just think so. Who is sitting there in power when he takes some? And he says that it cannot be done differently. Well, okay, you will say that this is a forbidden argument, but still, let's say the United States in relation to Iraq, for example.
I'm not ready to discuss the Iraq issue. You're not American. I'm not Iraqi. Wrong topic to bring up.
The British and Argentina for the Falklands Islands. Well, there was such a conflict, after all. How to deal with such things.
After all, the Falklands were the British territory.
Argentinians didn't think so.
It was between. They think or don't think. It's their own personal business. There are internationally recognized borders. At the beginning of the Falklands War, it was the territory of Great Britain. The Argentine military junta came to power. They had to show their strength, unite the Argentine society. They decided that they needed to seize these islands. The Argentine aggressor is clear here. Great Britain defended its territorial integrity. The Argentines can think whatever they want. It's their right. They could even write in their textbooks that they were right while they had a junta in power. But when there will be a democratic society, there will be a rethinking of this war.
Is there a junta in Argentina now?
No, I say that if the junta comes to power again, they can rewrite it.
Well, it was based on the fact that in the 21st century it was impossible to solve problems that way. Well, politicians say that war is a solution to political issues. Well, the final answer, I don't remember how to say it correctly, or how they said it. Well, it's a continuation.
This is a continuation of politics, but with different methods.
You think so, too?
What do you mean? Do I think so too? War is bad. That's it.
So, you don't support this point of view?
War is bad. War in Europe is always the beginning of the Third World War. All world wars started in Europe, and we need to do everything possible to prevent war.
But the war is bad, not only in Europe, but everywhere.
It's bad everywhere. But the world wars have never started outside of Europe so far. And to start a war in Europe, as a certain president did, I won't be naming him. You need to have nothing in your head and not understand that it can be the beginning of the Third World War. What is it waged for?
I think that the war should not have been started, because in any case, because...
Especially in Europe.
I wouldn't want it to start anywhere, but unfortunately it happens. You are an interesting interlocutor. Ought I remember something else, but...
How do you see the end of this war?
I don't know yet again, because...
Would be great if you did.
I still have a feeling, a sort of conviction or suspicion, a thought that the war is a kind of a deal in some very high positions somewhere there. It keeps bothering me.
It's a conspiracy theory.
I agree, I support it, so that you understand.
I don't support conspiracy theories.
That's why.
That's how you could imagine the situation in Dunkirk in 1940, when Hitler gave a stop order not to attack the French and British troops that tried to evacuate to Britain.
By the way, why did he do that?
He was still hoping to negotiate with Britain. For Hitler, the British were race appropriate, and he thought that he could still negotiate with them. And since he was going to fight in the East sooner or later, he didn't need a war on two fronts. It was an attempt to negotiate with Churchill, or whoever was in charge at the moment.
Well, it seems so, but Churchill was the one against any deals.
Churchill was against any deals. But that is the understanding for today.
Why didn't the British support the Poles in 1939?
They supported, but could not carry out large-scale hostility. In order to support the Poles, you need to have a large land army. Britain did not have it. In order to transfer at least some of the land troops to Poland, you need to have superiority in the air. The British did not have superiority in the air. There was a Battle of Britain, if you remember.
Yes, the air battle.
So in the end, It was physically impossible to do.
And the French were not on the side of the Poles?
The French were also on the side of the Poles, but the French society did not want to fight, and the French government acted on the whims of the French society. No one wanted to fight in the East for unknown countries. This was exactly the situation in Munich in 1938, when Hitler was given the Sudetenland region. This is all the consequences of the First World War. No one wanted to start a war. They believed that it was necessary to make concessions to Hitler only if someone worse came to power in Germany. Such was the common thought. And they went to all concessions in Eastern Europe. This led to the fact that Hitler felt the taste of blood and realized that no one would speak against him.
If you're a historian, then the First World War is Germany's revenge. Maybe I'm not understanding it right. For Franco.
Germans won in the Franco-Prussian War. You're wrong. In 1871, the Germans won the Franco-Prussian War.
I just don't remember who started the First World War. Well, the shot of Sarajevo, but who really?
Austria declared war on Serbia.
What about the Germans and the French?
Later, the Serbian government asked Nikolai II of Russia for support, and Nikolai II declared mobilization. The Germans opposed the mobilization and declared war on the Russian Empire. I don't remember in detail how the hostilities were going on there.
And the French, since they were in Entente, said,
England, France, and Russia are also bloc of intent.
all the roots are in the World War, won in the end.
Moreover, there is a point of view in European history that paves the way of modern history. It is about that there was one great war of 1914 and 1945, a big war that had a small break from 1918 to 1939, because during this period there were a lot of local conflicts in Europe. Unfortunately, people don't know much about it. There were a lot of local conflicts because the borders changed after the First World War. Each country believed that the borders were not fair and tried to take away some neighbor's territory. But until 1939, this did not lead to war.
1 second, I have to. I need to charge my phone. Wait a minute.
Let's finish then.
Unfortunately, the conversation has to be interrupted. It's all on me. Wait a minute. If you want to interrupt, there are no questions. The conversation is interesting, at least for me. Since you are, let's say, oh, there it is. You are more educated in some things than I am, so I'm interested in.
I am not more educated. I just have more information on this topic than you.
Stop. What is education? What's education in that case, then?
Education is not only information, it is also the comprehension of information. It is not enough to read the whole Wikipedia. You need to understand the connection between facts.
At least my education allows me to draw some conclusions, perhaps superficial, but nevertheless, about some things.
In any science, conclusions are made on the basis of not just superficial facts, but a deep study of analysis of some facts.
I agree.
And when they cling to one or two facts that they like, they say, I know these two facts, and I will draw such a conclusion from it, and try to convince me otherwise.
I have a friend who is a historian. I asked him once, well, since Europeans have a low birth rate, and the European nation is dying, he said, well, so what? Yes, once a Roman was in charge in Rome, barbaric waves were rolling down, and he was sitting there reading Virgil. That's just a historical process.
Then the barbarian came, studied the same Virgil, became Hellenized or Romanized. There were always huge migrations in Europe, and to think that this Frenchman is only the one who was born in France, that doesn't happen today. The waves of migration began to develop actively in Europe from the end of the 19th century. What will you do with this case? Close the borders.
Well,
Then the population of Europe will die off.
we are approaching the extinction of the Caucasian race, unfortunately.
Why, unfortunately, you're a racist then. You're sorry for the Caucasians and not the Mongoloid. I don't care what race
I'm
it
Caucasian
is.
myself.
So, a European is your racial definition. For me, the racial definition doesn't matter. The main thing is that a person becomes a member of this socio-cultural community. Like, is person black or white, as long as they consider themselves Ukrainian. Like my colleague, I always tell this story. I have a colleague who has a Vietnamese student. His parents emigrated from Vietnam, and they sell jeans at our market.
Well, it's a common thing.
Yes, he was born in Ukraine. His name is Lee. He's a typical Vietnamese. And my colleague asked him, Lee, who do you consider yourself, Vietnamese or Ukrainian? He says, of course, I am Ukrainian. I don't speak Vietnamese very well. We only communicate at home. I don't know the history of Vietnam and the culture of Vietnam at all, because I was born in Ukraine. And I know the Ukrainian culture, as well as the history. I know it perfectly well. I am a Ukrainian. And it's great. I don't care
There's
what
a
his race
saying
is.
that a Russian is the one who has a Russian heart. Then a Ukrainian is the one who has a Ukrainian heart.
Absolutely right. Because being Russian or Ukrainian are sociocultural, self-perception. Half of the Russian elite were Germans, let alone the imperial family. Half of the army were French, Turks, Moldavans, Serbs, and so on. But they accepted being Russian, and we all know them as Russian commanders. Although they are, for example, Cantomirs were from Moldavia, there were Turks and so on. It doesn't matter where they came from. They accepted this sociocultural society. They switched to this language. This process is called assimilation. You can't get away from it. Another thing is that if migrants don't integrate into this society, this is a problem. For example, there are a lot of Turks who don't integrate in Germany. They live in separate quarters. They consider themselves Turks and don't want to consider themselves Germans.
Yes, that's true.
And this is really common in Europe. And if it's like Zinedine Zidane, who is from Morocco, or wherever, a famous French footballer who considers himself a real Frenchman, or Omar Sy, an awesome black French actor who considers himself a Frenchman and not a foreigner from Nigeria or wherever. When they are not part of this society, and they consider themselves Frenchmen, does the color of his skin matter? If he reads La Fontaine, Voltaire, Diderot, and so on, and considers himself a Frenchman,
I'm not very much into the concepts of cultural Marxism, but I think it's from here.
this is not cultural Marxism. This is assimilation. What color is his skin? It doesn't matter to me. If a person came from somewhere in the depths of Africa, but he is Ukrainian, he speaks Ukrainian, well, that's fine.
How do you think? How much is the Ukrainian society ready to this kind of ideas or statements?
I think it's not ready yet. I think so. And maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe not. We have a good anecdote. I don't know if you speak Ukrainian, but you can translate it into Russian or translate it into the original.
Tell Ukrainian.
In Ukrainian, do you remember who the Banderites are?
Yes, of course.
People who fought for Ukraine's independence against the Russians, against the Soviet Union.
We can say that it's true, even though Bandera is a divisive figure.
He is a good figure.
By the way, let's talk about it.
Yes, let's talk about Bandera. So, old Banderite comes into a bus somewhere in the western Ukraine. And he needs to find out if there is some Russian sitting in the bus. He comes in, raises his rifle, says, "Tell me what time it is," and there is a black guy sitting. And the guy says, "Half to the third, old man." And the Banderite says, "Sit down, son. I see that you are not a Muscovite."
I know this anecdote.
Ukrainian society is quite tolerant, I think. Perhaps some part is not ready to accept another color of skin and another eye shape.
From your point of view, why Bandera? I once spoke in a roulette, a young man in a mask. It's clear that he doesn't like Russians, he's got a trident, and so on. I asked about Bandera. He said he considers Bandera a traitor to the Ukrainian people. Why? Just because.
He studied the biography of Bandera poorly. What can I do to him?
Oh, hi. I see. I'll have to finish the conversation. Unfortunately.
Time's up for Bandera. Do you want me to recommend any literature on him?
Sure, if you wish.
There is a book about Bandera. I have not finished reading it yet. This is a German historian of Polish origin.
Wait a second. Yes, no, it's Sergei. They got out, right? Yes.
Yeah, man. Historian of Polish origin, Grzegorz Rosolinski Liebe. I'm sure that the book is translated into Russian. It's called Bandera, Fascism, Totalitarianism, and something after that. Well, it's enough to Google the name of Grzegorz Rosolinski Liebe and read it. This is an anti-Bandera book, where Bandera is a fascist, a scoundrel, and so on. There is also a Russian historian who lives in Berlin, at the Berlin University, Alexander Gorgundov. He has a bunch of books on the Bandera movement. There is a Ukrainian historian, Vladimir Vyatrovich, who is a specialist on the Bandera movement. These are people who say that Bandera is a leader of the national liberation movement.
I wanted to ask you something else, but it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Good luck.
Goodbye.